Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. The UN panel of experts on North Korea disbanded after Russia vetoed an extension of its mandate. How can the international community continue to monitor sanctions on North Korea? Also, is there a gap between the US and South Korea on how to denuclearize North Korea? Today, we discuss the latest developments on North Korea.
That work should have been able to continue. In fact, this work is as important as ever.
It goes without saying that there would have to be interim steps toward ultimate denuclearization.
In the studio with me, Mr. Scott Snyder, the President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also served as the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Also joining us, Mr. Anthony Ruggiero, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Ruggiero was the National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense during the Trump administration. He was also NSC Director for North Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, the UN Security Council panel of experts on sanctions monitoring on North Korea officially disbanded on April 30th. The United States and 50 other countries stressed the need to continue its mission. What do you think will be the results from the latest developments?
Well, I think there's no question that this is a setback because we're going from a UN-mandated effort to investigate North Korean sanctions to something that is really going to be multilateral rather than universal in nature. And so I'm sure that the governments concerned will find a coalition that can support the objectives of this mission. I just don't think that it will be able for the mission to be implemented as effectively multilaterally as it could under a universal mandate.
Mr. Ruggiero, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Green feels that the idea is to have some kind of body within either in the General Assembly or something outside of the UN system. Now that China and Russia are obstructing the sanctions enforcement, is there a feasible way to have an effective body outside of the UN system?
Yeah, I think, look, it's terrible that the panel of experts has gone away. The Russians shouldn't have vetoed it, but all this effort, the time and diplomatic resources is a waste of time. Any other circumstance outside the UN is not going to be seen, as Scott said, by China or Russia as definitive in any way. I would much rather use any of those resources. How many resources is it going to take? Let's just say conservatively in the US government, 10 people to work on this project. I'd rather put those 10 people in the State Department or the Treasury Department actually implementing the sanctions. And this is part of the problem, and you showed it in your opening video, is that this administration is more focused on, behind the podium at the UN with a bunch of countries talking about how China and Russia are really bad at the UN, but not really doing anything about it. Let's be clear that the UN Security Council actually hasn't acted on anything from those panel of experts reports since 2017, 2018. So how effective have they actually really been? Yes, again, that's because of Russia and China, but we're not, the US and our allies are not picking that up and actually implementing those sanctions. That's the real problem to me.
So Russia and China are the key. Is there any way to elicit their cooperation on sanctions enforcement on North Korea?
I mean, we don't need it. mean, the part of the problem is they're the ones violating it, right? When we talk about North Korea has access to the international financial community, system, that's through China, mostly through China, less through Russia because of Russia sanctions now. And when you look at the North Koreans are able to operate now, the Russians are cooperating with North Korea on the military side, probably on the space side, worries, I think, about the missiles and the nuclear side. So they're just not implementing those sanctions. So frankly, most of the targets are going to be China and Russia related. So we don't really need their help to do that.
Mr. Snyder, do you also think that U.S. doesn't need China and Russia's help? There were times in 2017 when Russia and China agreed to have strong sanctions on North Korea.
I think that our objectives would be better served if we're able to cooperate with China and Russia in implementation. The problem is that China and Russia have decided not to implement. So essentially, under the current system, our front door is locked, but the fence is being torn down on the back, and China and Russia are building a highway to supply North Korea with the goods that we don't want North Korea to have. So we clearly have a problem. Whether or not we can unilaterally generate the necessary pressure on China and Russia to effectively uphold a sanctions regime, well, we can try that, but it's definitely less effective than what we would get if China and Russia were cooperating.
Mr. Ruggiero, in January, debris from North Korean Hwasong-11 missile was found in Ukraine. How is this revelation all the more alarming after Russia vetoed the mandate of the panel of experts?
Right, it just reconfirms what was suspected, right? Before that, I think we were seeing a lot of imagery of shipments and vessels going back and forth, and the White House making statements about what North Korea was providing to Russia, but now we're seeing the actual implementation of that. North Korea probably gets some information on how those missiles are operating back to North Korea, so that's a benefit. And then this is not being done for free, right? The Russians, it used to be, 5-10 years ago, we thought, well, the Russians would stay away from cooperation with North Korea on the space and missile and maybe even the nuclear side. And now I think that there's an opening door for that, for North Korea to get a lot of that expertise, which would help them in some ways leapfrog the technologies that they're working on now.
So what was really interesting about the Hwasong-11 announcement is that the White House spokesperson actually cited the panel of experts' report conclusions as authority for proving that Hwasong-11 was transported and used in Ukraine. And so we're not going to have that anymore. That's going to be gone. So that's an actual tangible evidence, in addition, of course, to the announcement that Russia is providing hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel oil to North Korea. So maybe that's the quid pro quo. Certainly, Hwasong-11 signaled that the scope of the Russian-North Korea exchange relationship was expanding beyond what I think we had originally anticipated.
But also, just to be clear, I agree, but the administration didn't take the next step, which is to do something about it, right? Saying that from the Brady Room or from the White House or in Turtle Bay at the UN is one thing. Saying it behind a podium, doing something about it, affecting North Korea's revenue stream in China, affecting Russia in some other way, they're not doing that. They're not doing enough. I know Russia is under a lot of sanctions, but we're not seeing the impact on North Korea cooperating with Russia. So it's one thing, whether it's a panel of experts or a US report, to say this thing is happening. It's another to take that next step and actually do something about it. And that's the missing piece that we should be focused more on, not all of these efforts. It's going to take them months to stand up a monitoring organization that no one's going to listen to. And that's going to be a waste of time.
But that monitoring organization does do fact-finding, which would be the base for another round of sanctions that other countries can work on.
No one's going to listen to them. They're not going to get any answers from China and Russia, which are the culprits in violating these sanctions. It's not like their reports are going to go anywhere beyond that. I just don't understand where the next step is. I mean, if this is about diplomacy and we're sort of spinning our wheels and we're more focused on trying to shame Putin and Xi and Kim. If that's our focus, that's fine. I mean, we can do that. The U.S. can do that tomorrow. They can put out their own North Korea reports if they want. They could join with South Korea, Japan, a couple other countries. They can do that tomorrow if they want. But if they're really serious about doing something about it, where you get that information from is not as important or impactful.
Now I want to move to denuclearization of North Korea. Recently, there were discussion of interim steps, and Jang Ho-jin, South Korea's national security director, said the U.S. has confirmed many times, even from senior level, that there is no such thing as interim step, and said that we don't need to be very concerned about that. And the National Security Council told VOA that by saying that the U.S. is willing to consider interim steps, we're making clear that we recognize that building trust with the DPRK and making progress toward denuclearization will take time. Now, Mr. Snyder, do you see a gap between Washington and Seoul in the idea of interim step? And what does this tell us about the coordination between the two countries on this very important diplomatic issue?
Well, first, I think that we shouldn't really be negotiating with ourselves about what North Korea will accept when it's clear that North Korea is unwilling to engage. And so in some ways, the point is moot as to whether there might be some kind of difference in shading or approach on this issue. What I see from the U.S. side is a greater willingness to have some form of engagement with North Korea diplomatically, not necessarily strictly focused on denuclearization. Maybe the South Korean side is more skeptical of that. But what I think is important is that if North Korea intends to exploit any difference between the U.S. and South Korea on this issue, the only way that North Korea will be able to exploit that difference is, in fact, if North Korea engages in diplomacy with some other party. Which they haven't done yet.
The reason why Washington is not so much focused on denuclearization, do you think that's because Washington wants to de-escalate the rising tensions on the Korean Peninsula, or is it because of the upcoming elections?
Well, I think that there should always be a concern about the need to be able to have a channel of communication in the context of crisis. And I really can't speak to the administration's immediate political motives at this particular moment, because I simply don't know the answer to what the discussion has been like around that issue and around the phrasing that has been used in recent weeks from the NSC or from the State Department.
Mr. Ruggiero, what do you think is the political motivation from the Seoul side when Seoul says that U.S. senior level officials are just disregarding the idea of interim steps? Why are they saying this publicly?
Well, if I had to guess, I think the South Koreans realize that this president could be a lame duck in 6 months, and the South Koreans are going to continue potentially with a second-term President Trump. So they don't want to lock themselves into an interim deal that may be a bad deal for all sides. The other, I agree with everything Scott said. The other thing I'll just say is, having been at the six-party talks and some of these other ones, is what is that going to look like? The U.S. has no leverage whatsoever over North Korea. As I noted, Kim is very comfortable now. So what's going to happen? We're going to pick up where we left off, and Kim is going to ask for a release of the UN sanctions that we're not implementing anyway, that we're not implementing, the Chinese are not implementing, the Russians are not implementing. That's not going to be enough for Kim to even stop Yongbyon, which was has been the offer since 1994. It's going to require the US side to give up much more to get much less. And so I just don't understand when they say interim steps, what does that look like? North Korea is not going to, at the goodness of their heart, just agree to a fissile material ban. Like, they're not going to stop producing HEU or plutonium. It's just not in their nature. So I don't understand what we, the US side, would be willing to give up. So that's probably where the South Koreans are doing their own calculus and saying, hey, what are they actually looking to do to give up from the US/allied side?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But since there were no talks between Washington and Pyongyang for many years, isn't there an advantage, a benefit out of rekindling the talks between the two countries?
Talks are not free. I mean, they come with a price, right? And the price is even the minimal sanctions that we're doing now. the defensive drills, some of these other things the North Koreans will ask before they even sit down at a table. Before they even sit down at a table with the Chinese, assuming that we would have the Chinese arbitrate for us as we did in the Bush administration and elsewhere, it's not going to be free. So what exactly are we willing to give up? And that's where I would, not to put myself in President Yoon's shoes, but I would imagine he's thinking, hey, I have a couple more years here, potentially with a new president, a different kind of president. Why would I make any deal sitting in Seoul that 6 months from now could be dead on arrival because a new president, a new secretary of state, new all the way down the line are coming in and will have a different approach to North Korea?
So the key here really is that we're not going to see any diplomatic negotiations with North Korea unless North Korea actually sends a demand signal. And so that means that no matter how many times we ask North Korea to come to talks, unless the North Koreans have decided that they want to come to talks, it's a waste of time. And so I think that's really the critical element that has been missing in recent years is there's no evidence that the North Koreans want to talk. Therefore, I don't think we're going to talk.
Now, Mr. Snyder, in a recent interview, former President Trump emphasized that South Korea, being a wealthy nation, should increase its financial contributions to the cost of maintaining U.S. forces in Korea. How fair is President Trump's statement given the latest geopolitical situation in Northeast Asia?
Well, the statement, I think, reminds everyone of President Trump's prior position in the first Trump administration as related to the cost of defense sharing with South Korea. The point that I would make is that the U.S.-South Korea relationship is different from where it was before, and the level and scope of engagement by South Korea globally in the context of the alliance has changed. And so I would actually make the argument that even though President Trump made demands for increased burden sharing directly from South Korea bilaterally, the Biden administration has actually found ways for South Korea to be more engaged regionally and globally in ways that are also contributions to our shared objectives. And so I don't know how to do the cost benefit in terms of comparing those two approaches, but I would say that that's one of the factors that one has to look at as one thinks about which one is better.
Mr. Ruggiero, as Mr. Snyder just said, President Trump's latest comment reminds a lot of people of his position during the first Trump administration. Does he still have the same idea regarding the cost sharing with allies? And when compared to other U.S. allies, how does South Korea's contributions compare with those other countries?
Right. I think, Scott is right. It's a different president, different government in South Korea. So that it'll all depend on how they kick it, hit it off potentially. Obviously the president had a strong relationship with Japan. Former President Trump did, and somewhat, middle of the road relationship, maybe putting it diplomatically, with South Korea. A lot of that was because of the North Korea policy. But the one thing with former President Trump is that in a lot of ways, allies shouldn't be surprised, right? I mean, this is something that he has been saying for quite some time, not just with regard to South Korea, but with regard to NATO, where the United States provides a lot of resources, and many of those countries who have agreed to a certain funding standard have not met that standard. And so that, I believe that's going to be a focus across the board when it comes to U.S. troops and, frankly, the nuclear umbrella and our extended deterrence and all these other things, making sure that the cost-benefit analysis is either equal or at least not overwhelmingly toward the other country. So I think you'll see that if President Trump has a second term, and people should not be surprised because it's something he focused on in his previous term.
South Korea spends on defense spending 2.5% of its GDP, which is much higher than European NATO allies, which do not many of them spend 2% of their GDP. So, and some observers say that President Trump is actually more focused on eliciting more defense spending from NATO allies and not so much East Asian allies.
It remains to be seen. It depends on how President Trump addresses the issue if he comes back into office. And see, we don't really know. But I think that the other factor that we haven't really mentioned is that South Korea is a major investor now in the United States. That wasn't really the case in the first Trump administration, and a lot of that investment is going to red states. So I think that the politics of this issue may also change depending on the configuration and interaction of a second Trump administration and other power holders in the legislative branch.
Mr. Ruggiero, former President Trump has suggested that if the burden-sharing negotiations with South Korea do not meet his expectations, then he might consider withdrawing U.S. forces in Korea. What would be the strategic consequences in the regional security and U.S. interests in the region?
Yeah, I think that's also another added difference here, where the architecture in East Asia and Asia more broadly, whether it's the Quad or AUKUS, or I know a lot of these are groups that South Korea considers themselves, on the cusp of joining, or at least being tangentially associated with. A lot of those are building on what the Trump administration started with the change in U.S.-China policy. So I think as people are policy when an administration comes in. It'll depend on who's in some of these key positions. But I think a lot of the people who are rumored understand how South Korea, our troops in South Korea and Japan and elsewhere fit into the broader architecture of not only deterring North Korea, but in some ways deterring China and working toward ensuring that the Chinese don't act against Taiwan. And just on the Europe side, I do think that there are countries that are looking at a potential second Trump administration, and they should be looking at how much they are spending on defense, because they have made a commitment, and they're in some cases not even close to those commitments. And that is something that I expect a second President Trump will focus on. I wouldn't be surprised if a second Biden administration focuses on it either, because that is going to become harder and harder to move some of that assistance through the Senate, which potentially might be Republican next year, if those countries, with the Ukraine war continuing, are not close to or have a plan to getting to their 2%. So I think this is more of a bipartisan U.S. issue than a focus just on former President Trump.
Mm. And Mr. Snyder, you did touch upon this a little bit earlier, but how do the difference in how the Biden administration and Trump administration approach the burden sharing, how would that influence U.S.-South Korea relations in the long term? Your latest book kind of reminds me of this issue.
Well, you're asking me to give away the punchline of the book. It's a spoiler, but really, I think that the main issue that I see is that the Biden administration has, together with the Yoon administration, embedded the alliance in a broader set of relationships that have global scope. And the Trump administration approach so far appears to be focused on bilateral issues rather than dealing with the alliance in the context of a broader multilateral relationship. And so that will be a different approach that may lead to a different set of outcomes. But what I can say is that for both the US and South Korea, there is a strong and compelling and growing convergence of interests that I think require both sides to cooperate with each other.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Ruggiero, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.